I thought I would find the writing and recording of part two emotional, and so it proved to be, particularly recalling more recent events where I shed a tear or two. And along with sadness, the recording of the episode was a nightmare, ticking the stress and anxiety boxes due to some technical issues that resulted in 57 edit points, a record I hope I do not repeat. I may again follow a somewhat non-linear narrative, as thinking about recent past events could prompt memories of even earlier ones. Welcome to Transwise Transstrong. I am Caroline O'Reilly. Episode 12, A Journey of Transition, Carolyne's Story, Part 3. Before I decided on Christmas Day 2018 to begin transitioning, I had found several months earlier some helpful internal advice for BBC members of staff who decide to transition, and reading this finally prompted me to consider transitioning. Also, after a bit of research, I came across the Beaumont Society, founded in 1966, which is the UK's longest established transgender support group, and I decided to join. The application form asked for my feminine name. I first thought about the female version of my birth name, my dead name, but I really wanted to break from my unauthentic self. I decided to fill the application form in the new year, and in the meantime, the name Caroline came to mind, and I liked how it sounded. But why did it come to mind? Then, the next day, I realized it was the first name of someone we have met before, Caroline Cosey. I worried anyone who knew about Caroline might think I'd copied her name, but I really liked it, and I checked the BBC's email address book and found many Carolines ending INE, but only three ending YNE. And I liked how the latter looked written down, so I decided to spell my name Carolyne. Unfortunately, it can be pronounced Caroline as well as Caroline, and I am often called by the former. Oh well, at least it's a talking point. I described my former name as my dead name, origin of which, according to the OED, is a 2010 Twitter post, and to be dead name is when a trans or non-binary person is referred to by their former name, and dead naming could be considered a form of hate speech. So by joining the Beaumont Society, I took my first step on my yellow brick road. However, the Emerald City seemed far in the distance, and then I still wasn't sure if I even wished to travel all the way there. I was a senior operations engineer and a shift leader at the BBC, and not wanting to leave, when I returned to work in the new year, I told my colleagues I was trans, and then all my relations and friends. The nearest clinic to me was the Tavistock and Portman NHS Foundation Trust, and I found on their site that they accepted GP self-referrals, and after a GP appointment my referral form was Tavistock bound. But what to do next? Why, I waited for a reply. So for another step on my yellow brick road, I made an appointment with a hairdresser's, and in early March I had my hair coloured, highlighted, cut and blow dried, and the next day I had my ears pierced. Two more steps taken. Also, I felt body hair was not very feminine, and also in March, I found locally where I could have my body hair removed by the technique of sugaring, more gentle than waxing. As for facial hair removal and also voice feminization speech therapy, that would be discussed at my first appointment with the gender clinic. And so I emailed the clinic about a possible date for this first appointment, and the reply was, unfortunately, the waiting time for a first appointment is currently over 2 years. Bollocks! Bad as over 2 years was, now at the Tavistock it is 5.5 years. Insert expletive here. A 2+ year wait for another step? I don't think so. I was fortunate that I could financially sidestep onto a parallel private brick route, and another bit of research led me to a laser hair removal clinic in London. Laser hair removal works by the melanin that gives hair its colour, absorbing the laser light energy and converting it into heat, which damages the hair follicle. Although effective, it is not a permanent method of hair removal, nor is it, unfortunately, effective on grey, unpigmented hair. The laser was invented by Theodore Maiman using a synthetic ruby and flash lamps on the 16th of May 1960 at Hughes Research Laboratories. Then, in 1996, R. Rox Henderson and Melanie Grossman discovered that a laser could damage the hair follicle, reducing hair growth. Next, the voice. Time for more research, which in June brought me to Christella Anthony, Voice and Speech Service, who I would highly recommend. Achieving a female voice is more than raising the pitch, and a professional speech therapist can help you bring out your true feminine voice. And if you are trans male, bring out your masculine voice. Christella has developed the Voice Up app, which can be used as an option for practicing developing female voice or for trans females to use alongside any voice therapy they are having. Although I had chosen my female name, initially I didn't ask my work colleagues to use it, but as my voice began to change, I asked to be called Carolyne, and there were only a couple of instances of accidental dead naming. I've likened transition to embarking on a journey, and for a successful transition, one needs to bring those who know you on this journey as well, hence my gradual approach to transitioning. I mentioned that the BVC provided information for trans staff. Well, 6 months into my transition, a manager who is now a friend from BBC's Diversity and Inclusion D&I department asked if I would like to join a working group to assess a trans insight session provided by an external trainer. I said I would, and found it very informative. This was then rolled out for BBC staff who wished to have a better understanding of what it meant to be trans and how to be a trans ally to trans members of staff. But in the future, this external training company would cease to provide this training for the BBC and would give rise to an opportunity for someone not a million miles from this podcast. I had a fair bit of grey facial hair, which was an issue for laser hair removal. Fortunately, the clinic could recommend an electrologist, who I switched to in July. However, electrolysis is a lot slower, as it is literally one hair at a time, so it takes a long time for total clearance. Electrolysis was first used to remove ingrown eyelashes in 1875 by ophthalmologist Dr. Charles E. Michel. Then, in 1916, Professor Paul M. Cree developed the galvanic method using direct current, and in 1923, Dr. Henri Bordier developed the photolysis method that used high-frequency alternating current. Finally, in 1948, Henry E. St. Pierre invented, with service engineer Arthur Ralph Hinkle, a combined galvanic and photolysis method called blend. And today, all three methods are still used. However, although physical changes were progressing well, I was finding the psychological adjustment difficult and mentioned this to Christella, and she gave me the contact details of a psychotherapist, someone we've met before, Dr. Dembski. It was through my therapy session that Dr. Dembski diagnosed that I had obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD, and later that I was on the autistic spectrum. Diagnosis of autism in adults is not easy, as some people with a neurological trait mask, which is concealing a neurological trait and may be done unconsciously. I also came to understand that my periods of depression were due to me trying to live an unauthentic version of myself. Through my therapy, I came to understand who I was, and it was towards the end of 2019 that I realized that I had to reach the Emerald City. So I took another step, which was the desire to begin gender affirming hormone therapy, GAHT, and Christella was again able to help me. So I was progressing well, acquiring a feminine voice, relinquishing my facial hair, having psychotherapy support. Then in January 2020 came news reports of a new virus and a place in China, Wuhan. And on the 29th of January, the UK had its first two confirmed cases of COVID-19. In February, I legally changed my first name to Carolyne by deed poll, then had the fun of updating my work records, council records, etc., anywhere that held my dead name. Britain was yet to resemble scenes from 28 days later. Then, on the 11th of March, the WHO declared COVID-19 a global pandemic. 5 days later, the UK government advised stopping non-essential contact and travel. Then, on Monday, the 23rd of March, the first lockdown began. Fortunately, I'd completed my voice therapy course and my psychotherapy could be online, but electrolysis and visits to the hairdressers stopped. Here's a thought. Italy had its first death from COVID on the 7th of February, 2 weeks earlier than Britain's first deaths. Had the government enacted the lockdown 2 weeks earlier, would it have perhaps reduced the eventual death toll? I initially went into work, but after 3 days was asked to work from home, which lasted nearly 3 months. And towards the end of my home working, my management team decided that shift leaders like myself should interview to become a higher grade. Well, like after returning to work after a long holiday, I had become unfamiliar with many of our systems and so failed the interview. Turns out I'm a bit rubbish at interviews. In May, the first lockdown ended and I resumed going into work and could see my therapist. Until now, apart from wearing neutral colour nail varnish and blouses, I had not explored my feminine side more. Dr. Dembski suggested I might consider wearing skirts and makeup, and once I did, I wondered why I hadn't started earlier. More steps taken, and in July, mask wearing was added to outside wear when the UK made it mandatory. Before one can start GAHT, you require a psychological assessment to determine if you have gender dysphoria and an endocrinology assessment. So in June 2020, I had a private video consultation with a Dr. Lenahan, who is a HM government registered gender diversity specialist, who diagnosed that I did indeed have gender dysphoria. I found my consultation so life affirming, and afterwards I had a smile on my face for the rest of the day. In September 2020, as a result of an employment tribunal ruling, Ms. Rose Taylor versus Jaguar Land Rover Limited, non-binary and other gender diverse people were now also afforded the protection from all forms of discrimination, victimization and harassment under the Equality Act 2010. Then, in October, I had a video consultation with an endocrinologist who explained what would be expected from hormone therapy, the side effects, long term risks, and the options to raise my estrogen level and correspondingly reduce my testosterone level. Estrogen promotes body fat redistribution, and testosterone blocking has, for some, negative side effects of impotence and loss of libido. For me, these were veritable positives, particularly the libido, as it was the wrong kind. At the end of the consultation, I was prescribed estrogen hormone patches, the same as used to treat the menopause, the safest option if you are over 35. Testosterone blocking was an injection every 12 weeks of a gonadotropin releasing hormone analog, as mentioned in Celebrating Trans Films Part 2, as this has the least side effects. Although I was aware of what to expect in terms of physical changes that GAHT would bring about, it was the profound psychological changes which came as a very pleasant surprise. I feel that testosterone may be a contributor to, but in no way an excuse for, negative male behavior. And as my testosterone level dropped and estrogen level rose, how I perceived and interacted with the world, how can I put it, became more feminine. Something I didn't mention in part 1 or 2 was porn. The thing is, after just a few months of being on GAHT, I no longer understood what the appeal was. I now thought about researching gender affirming surgery, and it mentioned removing hair from your genital area as a preparation. And yes, it is sometimes as painful as you might imagine. If you remember, I mentioned a long wait for a first appointment with the Tavistock. Well, in June 2021, the Nottingham Centre for Transgender Health Network launched a new pilot scheme, the East of England Gender Service, which was GP and nurse led, with the aim of reducing the waiting time for a gender service appointment. Towards the end of the year, I was contacted by them and switched my gender care to them, and I had my first appointment early December 2021, although by then what would usually be discussed at the first appointment was of course no longer relevant, although I did mention my wish to have gender affirming surgery. In 2022, I had further opportunities to try and pass the interview to become a higher grade, but still failed. It turns out I'm really rubbish at interviews, and I would no longer be a shift leader and would have to work regular night shifts, something I hadn't done for 14 years. I think not. Therefore, I resigned. I had to serve a notice period, but I used my unused annual leave to reduce it to about a month, and so on the 7th of July 2022, I became unemployed for the third time. However, in June, the Trans Insight session stopped, as the external company would no longer be carrying them out. At the time the Trans Insight sessions ended, I was still a BBC employee and therefore heard internally about this, so I feel that I can only make this observation. Don't believe everything you read. Knowing that I would be leaving soon, my manager friend from DNI asked would I be interested in helping to create an internal trans insight session that I would co-present. Needless to say, I jumped at the chance. I had 4 months' work as a freelancer. During 2023, as well as co-presenting a number of trans insight sessions, I had 2 assessments by 2 different doctors from the East of England Gender Service, a prerequisite before gender affirming surgery, and as both agreed surgery was in my best interest, all was good, except in June my depression returned with a vengeance. This time I knew the cause. It was because I was no longer working. However, after a phone GP appointment, I was prescribed antidepressant tablets, first at a low dose, then it was gradually increased to the maximum, which I am still on. I was also given the contact of a social prescriber who mentioned garden therapy, at which I met someone who would become a great friend. However, post surgery I stopped going, but then learnt of craft therapy where my friend and I go once a week, becoming very good at jigsaw puzzles. Towards the end of 2023, I saw my surgeon. Well, I explained the technique of the procedure, which is called a penile inversion and is considered the gold standard for gender affirming surgery. They also explained what could go wrong in rare cases. It was quite a lot to take in. My understanding of surgery, which may make anyone happy with their penis squirm, is the testes and erectile tissue is removed. Part of the end of the penis is reshaped to form a neoclitoris. Interestingly, the dorsal nerve connected to it is the same as to the clitoris in cisgender women. The urethra is reduced in length, and it and the neoclitoris is positioned where it would be on a cisgender woman, and the scrotum skin is used to form the labia majora and minora. There were a few more trans insight sessions during 2024, and before I knew it, my surgical date was approaching. However, before my surgery, I had an appointment for a pre surgical check, and then on Monday, the 15th of July 2024, the day after I checked into the Emerald City, aka the hospital, I had my genital reconstruction surgery. When I came round in the recovery area, I experienced for the second time a feeling of pure happiness. The first was when I said aloud that I was trans. Interestingly, in the UK and Republic of Ireland, surgeons are not called doctor, but if they are male, Mr. or Ms., Mrs. or Miss, a female, because historically physicians studied for a medical degree at university and therefore were awarded the title doctor, whereas surgeons trained via an apprenticeship and therefore had the honorific title Mr., as then I don't believe there were any female surgeons. I stayed in hospital for about a week, and before I left, I was taught how to dilate, which is where you insert into your neo vagina. Well, it kind of looks like a hard plastic dildo. First, a smaller diameter one for 5 minutes, then a larger one for 15 minutes. This is repeated 3 times a day for about 2 months. Then the frequency decreases to twice a day, then once, until after a year it's once a week for 5 minutes with the larger size. And why all this dilating? Well, your body thinks your brand spanking new vagina is a wound and tries to heal it. No! And for a while, my genital area resembled a colour scheme that would not have been unfamiliar to Francis Bacon. After I left hospital, I stayed with a relation for 2 weeks, then went home, and for quite a while I couldn't lift anything heavier than a pint of milk. My therapy sessions were back being online, and it was during this time that the idea for a podcast began to develop. And in mid November 2024, I began to write the script for what would be the first episode, In the Beginning, which took 3.5 months to write before it was published on the 22nd of February 2025. Now I aim for every 3 weeks. Although this episode, although covering the shortest period of time, just under 7 years, has taken 4 weeks. So all was good with the world. My body was now in alignment with my gender identity, and I found researching my podcast episodes intellectually stimulating. And then on Wednesday, the 16th of April 2025, there was the Supreme Court judgment in the case For Women Scotland Limited appellant versus the Scottish Ministers respondent. It was this judgment discussed in the episode Trans Lives Matter that I was alluding to in part 1 as an awful coda to the Equality Act 2010. And that wasn't the only consequences of that judgment, as before it was delivered, I contacted the BBC in March 2025 to let them know my recovery was going well and there would be no issues with me co-presenting a trans insight session, which also discusses being non-binary. I was told there was some uncertainty in regards of training. Then, 7 months later, on the 12th of October, I learnt as a result of a Freedom of Information request submitted to the BBC, the Trans Insight and another diversity inclusion session, LGBTQIA plus allies, had been paused. The reason given was that the BBC was investigating if sex was correctly used in these presentations. Well, I checked the script used for the Trans Insight presentation. It took less than 5 minutes, and I could see nothing wrong with how sex was used. Well, not wishing to end this episode on a downer, the Good Law Project believe, as a result of this ruling, the UK is now in breach of its obligations under the Human Rights Act and the European Convention of Human Rights, and they plan to ask the High Court for a declaration of incompatibility. Fingers crossed. This episode was written and presented by me, Carolyne O'Reilly. Thank you for listening. Next time, what's up, Doug?